A few hours later, I woke up in the hospital, feeling unsure about what happened. I could only see a bed and someone in a lab coat standing beside me. I asked, "What's going on? Where am I?" The nurse smiled at me and said, "You are in the hospital. It's nice to see you awake." I rubbed my eyes and asked what happened. She sighed and said, "You had stopped breathing." I took a deep breath and said, "Oh, how?" She placed a hand on my bed and said, "I don't know. All your tests came to be fine. We think it was a panic attack. Have you suffered from anxiety lately?" I looked up trying to think if I had suffered from a panic attack in the past and said, I just found out about having a half-brother. However, other than that, not really. Where are my family and friends?" She smiled and said, They are in the waiting room. I can call them inside if you want." I nodded in the affirmative. She smiled and said, "Okay." Then she walked out of the room. I asked myself, what is going on? Something similar never happened before. I placed my hands on my face. Then I heard footsteps coming towards my room and listened to a scream which grew louder as the footsteps got closer. It was a young girl yelling, "Sister!" Then I realized it was Colleen. Shane asked Colleen to stop screaming, but she refused to. Then Shane asked, "Can you at least stop running?" Colleen said, "Not till I get to her room." Then I heard a thud and her sighing. Then I heard Shane say, "Nice job, Nolan. Now I need to pick her up off the ground." After a few seconds, Colleen started screaming again. "Put me down, please, big brother." All I could do was look towards the door. Shane walked in with Colleen over his right shoulder. A few seconds later, I asked what happened. Shane frowned and said, "You collapsed at the JoJo." I looked down and said, "Oh, I think you can put Colleen down now. She hates getting tossed around." She frowns and said, "Yeah, you mean bastard." He lifted her off his shoulder, turned her towards him and said, "I'm not mean." Then he put her down. All of us started laughing. I smiled and said, "I don't know what happened to me, but I want to know more about it." Shane rolled his eyes and said, "Well, Nathaniel showed up, you collapsed, and I made him leave. I talked to Dad, by the way." I looked at him and asked, "What did he say?" Shane smiled as he replied, "He told me that all the agreements with his father were null and void in the present circumstances. What is going on?" I looked away and said, "It's a long story and I can't explain it right now." He rolled his eyes and said, "Tell me the shorter version of it." as I want to know it now. I looked down and said, "Not right now." Shane raised an eyebrow and said, "Why not? I'm your brother. I deserve to know." Dad dropped a bombshell on me, telling me about having 2 sisters, about who I never knew about, and I don't know anything about their lives. I looked downwards and said, "You have 5 sisters." Shane looked at me with a quizzical look on his face and asked, "What do you mean?" I looked him in the eye and said, "There were 6 of us." He looked at me with narrow eyes and said, "Where are the other 3? I looked down and said, "They died a week ago from an infection which had spread in several cuts inflicted upon them through whipping." He frowned and said, "Was Dad whipping his daughters? He is unbelievable." I shook my head in the negative. He narrowed his eyes and asked, "Who was it then?" I looked down and said, "Nathaniel's father, but our upbringing was different than yours." He furrowed his brow and said, "He let his so-called friend harm you, and all you say is about being brought up differently?" I looked down and said, "Look, I know you want to know why Dad finally told you about us, but I can't explain everything now." He nodded in agreement. Then the nurse came in. He clenched his jaw, looked at the nurse, and cleared his throat. She smiled, and as he asked, "Is her condition better so she can get discharged from the hospital?" She smiled and said, "Yes, sir. I need you to sign these forms, then she can leave." He smiled, crossed his arms as he said, "Okay, let's get this done so we can get her back home." She turned and nodded in agreement. She handed the papers to Shane, explained the details to him, then pointed to where he needed to sign. He nodded as the nurse walked out. God, the things I need to do for my family. I looked at him as if I didn't understand what he was talking about. And although I knew he was related to me by blood, we had just met. Is it possible for him to feel so emotionally close to us? He smirked and said, "Elena, you're my sister. No matter what, you're my family, related to me by blood. Nothing can stop us from protecting each other." I frowned and said, "You don't know that." He shrugged and said, "We will work everything out." I crossed my arms and said, "Okay, now what?" He smiled and said, "We are going home." He extended his hand, and I felt a smile spread on my face and raised my hand to get a hold of him, and I got up. We walked out of the hospital. We walk in the parking lot towards his car, and I hop in the back with Colleen. Once settled in the vehicle, Shane looked in his rearview mirror and asked, "So why wouldn't you tell me anything in there?" I shook my head and said, "As I'm on the wanted list, I cannot disclose my secrets." Colleen laughed and said, "She is an assassin for the dark arts. I don't know if you have heard of them, but they are why we are in this situation." Shane stared at the road ahead and asked, "What do you mean?" I smiled and said, "Well, I have finished my training, but we kill people for a living. Colleen hasn't yet reached the level I am on, but Gabriel technically sent us here to kill you. Oh, and for your information, I'm Ara, your sister's other half, or better known for being a vampire." He looked at me and immediately realized my eyes were of a different color. He said, "If you're supposed to kill me, why haven't you tried to do so till now?" Ara crossed her arms and said, "Our father wanted us to protect you. We have a plan to make you appear dead to the world, but you will still be alive." Then he looked away and started driving towards Nolan's house. Once Nolan was out of the car, he took us back to his mom's and locked himself in his room.